Our next speaker is Ted Bosley. Ted became director of the Gamble House, which is a United States National Historic Landmark here in Pasadena, in 1992. Since then, he's published and lectured widely on architects Greene and Greene and the American Arts and Crafts movement. For many years, he taught historic site stewardship in the Heritage Conservation Master's Degree program at the University of Southern California School of Architecture. Beginning next semester, he'll teach a similar course at Claremont Graduate University. Ted was curator of a major decorative arts exhibition in 2008-2009 called A New and Native Beauty, The Art and Craft of Greene and Greene. And it opened here at the Huntington Library and then traveled to Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C., and after that to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Ted is a native of San Francisco. He has an undergraduate degree in art history from the University of Southern California in Berkeley and an MBA from UCLA. And today he will be speaking on The House Beautiful, Truth to Nature in the Work of Greene and Greene.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. And I want to thank the Huntington Library for being willing to put on this fantastic conference on John Ruskin in this bicentenary year. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be asked to speak. I want to thank Jim Spates also for including California in this conference. I think that was a stroke of genius, and Gabriel Meyer, I think you might have had something to do with that. Thank you too, and it's been an opportunity for me to dig into Ruskin, which was long overdue, given his importance to California, as Gabriel has just pointed out so beautifully. So I was asked to speak on The House Beautiful. In the last decades of the 19th century, designers, artists, writers, decorators, and homemakers appropriated the house beautiful as an expression to reflect social aspiration to an aesthetic home environment. Indeed, it was part of the aesthetic movement's reaction to sameness and soullessness in home design, especially regarding machine-made furnishings produced out of the Industrial Revolution. The house beautiful ideal was a mid-market outgrowth of the aesthetic movement of the late 1870s and 1880s in Britain, and became aligned with the arts and crafts movement into the 1890s. The house beautiful ideal imbued the aesthetic movement with an uplifting moral tone, not to say therapeutic benefit, through its dedication to handcraft and the honest use of materials, and to conscious personal choices for home furnishings. An aesthetic home environment as an expression of morality was an idea influenced by the writings of John Ruskin. The prodigious output of William Morris was also a tremendous factor. He was a student and was hugely influenced by Ruskin's writing when he was a student at Oxford. And in his life, William Morris made the promise of the house beautiful a reality in the home. The promotion of the idea of the house beautiful was very much down to Oscar Wilde, our character on the right, who made it seem fashionable and desirable. Wilde himself was transformed as a student at Oxford by Ruskin, and he took his messages to much of the English-speaking world. This morning, I want to show how John Ruskin's essential message of truth to nature found special sympathy even here in distant California, and not least in the homes designed by Charles and Henry Greene, two brothers originally from Ohio. Ruskin famously railed against industrialization and presciently against the attendant plague clouds that foretold even our own tragic climate crisis. Like Thomas Carlyle before him, and like William Morris and the English architect Charles Robert Ashby, Ruskin criticized the usurping of hand labor by machine production. Dignity from labor and beauty in art production, a beauty derived from the imperfections of honest handcraft, were themes that resonated in America, albeit to a more nuanced degree than in England, given America's relative distance from the immediate ill effects of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, the effects of the Industrial Revolution were seen more benignly in America than in Britain. Morris's mantra, "Have nothing in your homes that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful," embodied philosophical tenets that would be held just as dear on the Pacific coast of America as in the heart of England, even if the message manifested itself differently in practice. During his famous American lecture tour in 1882, our friend on the right, Oscar Wilde, promoted the house beautiful and aesthetic ideals and the importance of selecting suitable decorative arts for the home. He drew liberally from Ruskin and Morris in this. In fact, he quoted them nearly verbatim and without attribution. I think we can call that plagiarism. Each of the 142 presentations Wilde gave throughout North America, 142 presentations, was designed to instruct the listener in the ways of cultivating taste and creating a beautiful home environment. 10 of these lectures were given in California, and I think it's fair to say that Oscar Wilde was pretty sure that we needed them. The intentional place swapping of the adjective and noun was calculated to transform an otherwise prosaic description, the beautiful house, into a more poetic phrase of higher purpose, the house beautiful. The earliest appearance of the phrase that I could find is in John Bunyan's 17th century morality tale, A Pilgrim's Progress. In it, the house, or sometimes palace beautiful, is an important stop on the pilgrim's journey, a place of pious gathering said to have been inspired by Houghton House in Bedfordshire. As you see on the lower right, near where Bunyan lived. In the course of his wanderings, Christian, the story's protagonist, arrives at the house beautiful. There you see one of the many sketches of the Pilgrim's Progress to illustrate the Pilgrim's Progress up in the upper left. He arrives at the house beautiful, where he is met by watchful, discretion, piety, prudence, and charity. Bunyan's house beautiful is a metaphor for the modern church, a literal house of God. In Ruskin, architecture's connection to morality merits close attention. Indeed, his overall relationship with God, nature, art, and architecture was thoroughly intertwined. And as Christopher Newell has observed, Ruskin, quote, Ruskin knew the keen observation and the authentic representation of a given subject was a proud and profound purpose. He perceived the natural world as a sacred inheritance, end quote. Indeed, Ruskin famously declares in the Seven Lamps of Architecture, and you can start booing any time now, because you've heard this quote at least twice before, quote, "When we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight, nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think, as we lay stone on stone, that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them," end quote. More than admonishing builders to build well, Ruskin is declaring that handcraft itself imbues moral meaning. To students, he preached a similarly moral message regarding the natural world. And again, thank you for previewing this quote, Gabriel. Quote, "Go to nature in all singleness of heart," he wrote in Modern Painters, "and walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thoughts but how best to penetrate her meaning and remember her instruction, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth," end quote. Rejoicing always in the truth. Ruskin's representations of nature did indeed rejoice in the truth. In these three examples, a beanstalk, a series of thistles, and one of his many exquisite peacock-feathered drawings, Ruskin seemed absolutely to rejoice in the minute details as he went about getting at the truth of nature. In 1875, he wrote to his beloved friend, Susie Beaver, and his letters to Susie Beaver are here at the Huntington. He wrote, quote, "I'm at work on your peacock feathers. I use your dear little lens deep in, and cannot exhaust their wonderfulness. Can't exhaust their wonderfulness, end quote. Similarly, Ruskin's drawings of architecture relied on a highly focused vision. His view of the built world may have produced only partial compositions much of the time, such as these, but this was his way of seeing, capturing, and remembering more truthfully, even as in the drawings on the left, if it means recording the weeds growing out of the cracks in the stone. You can see that there. And I'll just signal to you that there is a wonderful exhibition called 1919 in the Boone Gallery here at the Huntington, which has this drawing on exhibit. This is Ruskin's original drawings, not a print. Ruskin's published views on nature were well known and followed by artists, architects, and designers who promoted the house beautiful concept in the 1870s and 80s. E.W. Godwin, William Burgess, the pre-Raphaelite painters, the list goes on, and not just on the far side of the Atlantic, but on this side. And, of course, not least by William Morris, whose Morris and Company enterprise famously transformed theoretical discourse into commercial practice across many artistic disciplines. While he had his own method of expressing nature in building decoration, Morris revered Ruskin, and Ruskin, in turn, respected Morris. In one letter he said to Charles Eliot Norton, he said, "He's less of a prig than I thought he would be." Ruskin visited Morris in London on several occasions, and in 1877 joined Morris's Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings to aid the battle against ill-informed restorations that imposed fictive histories on old buildings, great and small. At the same time, in the words of Morris scholar Peter Stansky, Morris and Company undertook to redesign the world. The influence of Ruskin, Morris, and Wilde was altogether powerfully deep and broad. Wilde's lecture, titled The House Beautiful, and given in Wolverhampton in the West Midlands in 1884, so a couple of years after his American lecture tour, is said to have inspired the exuberantly aesthetic interior of Whittock Manor, seen here, with its, shall we say, superabundance of William Morris textiles and wall coverings, William de Morgan ceramics, pre-Raphaelite paintings, and you name it, it's all there. Meanwhile, the house beautiful idea also seeped as a sweet and achievable aspiration into art, such as in this watercolor and gouache by Gustavus Bouvier of three young ladies, in a classic example of the aesthetic interior. A Japanese screen on the left, blue and white ceramics, and a ginger jar on the mantel, peacock feathers in a jar on the mantel, decorative tile fireplace. The mirror reflects Morris-like wallpaper and textile portiere on the opposite wall, and I could swear that the painting that's reflected in that mirror is one of Gustavus Bouvier's own paintings that he's recapitulated for our benefit. And even peacocks on the table covering. All a comment on the aesthetic commitment of the occupants. Of interest is that one of the young ladies is dusting a decorative pot. Is she not leaving this task to the maid because she has none, or because the pot's too precious to risk in someone else's hands? Or is it because she wants to show her friends that she is modern and not above a bit of dusting? Either way, it should be noted that the artistic interior was not promoted exclusively to the wealthy as an agreeable distraction, as it may seem in this painting. In 1877, journalist and design critic Clarence Cook appropriated The House Beautiful as the book form title for his series of articles on interior domestic design in Scribner's Magazine. Cook and others, like Mrs. Huey's, whose 19th century book with faux 17th century type is shown on the right, were writing for the popular American market. the popular market generally. These were only two of the many accessibly written guides for the novice homemaker, mostly women who hoped to project an artistic sensibility to Victorian friends and callers. Literary figures were a part of the movement too. Mark Twain had his own House Beautiful, decorated by Louis Comfort Tiffany's associated artists in 1881, and Robert Louis Stevenson's collection, Underwoods, published in 1887, included his poem titled The House Beautiful, which seems to challenge the developing appetite for fitting out homes with lots and lots of decorative objects. The poem reminds us that one really only needs to look to God's gifts in nature for the decoration of a house. Was this a not so subtle shift away from Oscar Wilde's own confessed view of ornament being solely for pleasure, and instead turning us towards a more spiritual, Ruskinian search for truth and beauty in nature? By the late 1880s and early 1890s, Californians were ready to synthesize messages regarding home design and decorative arts from both sides of the Atlantic. In step with Stevenson, who had made his last visit to California in 1888, progressive architects in California, and particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, were moving beyond the overly decorated Victorian building style lately popular towards a simpler design vocabulary with nature as its muse. In the design manifesto entitled The Simple Home, published in San Francisco in 1904, Charles Keeler argued for homes built in unadorned wood, decorations taken from nature, and earth tones generally for wall colors. Keeler's mentor and friend, Bernard Maybeck, supported the manifesto, but also saw fit to break the rules of color whenever he wanted. On the left are four of Maybeck's house designs across the bay from San Francisco in the city of Berkeley, where the university resides. I'll just, at Sarah's expense, I'll just make a small correction. My degree in art history is from the University of California at Berkeley, not from the University of Southern California at Berkeley. So I don't. If I got it wrong there on the page, I do apologize. On the right is shown a small church of the Reverend Joseph Worcester in San Francisco, the Swedenborgian Church of the New Jerusalem. Worcester was an amateur architect and Swedenborgian minister and a mentor to architects and artists in the region, including William Keith, a Scottish painter, who had a studio in San Francisco. Maybeck and others were involved in the church project as well. While not a house, the church feels very much like one, with its home-like scale, fireplace at the back of the sanctuary, and solid handmade maple chairs rather than pews for seating. Note that one of these chairs was used as a prototype for the Mission line of furniture, which evolved into the hugely popular Craftsman style. Indeed, many credit the Reverend Worcester with introducing the rustic shingle style of architecture to California. Into this Western context arrived two young architects, the brothers Charles and Henry Greene, who would bring an artistic refinement to the rough-hewn architectural tradition of Worcester, Maybeck, Keeler, and their simple home adherents. Sorry, I'm just going back this one slide. You see the interior of the church, it's almost as if it's outside in the forest, isn't it? I mean, this is Reverend Worcester bringing branches of trees collected from nearby forests. It was entirely to teach the Swedenborgian idea, by the way, of the love of nature. So very much part and parcel of what we're talking about here in California. So Charles and Henry Greene, born and raised in Cincinnati to a young age, and then in St. Louis, after 3 years each at the Manual Training School of Washington University in St. Louis, which was, by the way, in America, the first of the hand, heart, and mind schools, with a full influence from Ruskin. The Greene brothers were academically and professionally trained afterwards in Boston at MIT, where they became alert to the world of art, where they also doubtless came into contact with Ruskinian writing and thought. And in Boston, they developed design sensibilities, applying them during apprenticeships with prominent architects, mostly successors of Henry Hobson Richardson, who had died just 2 years before the Greenes arrived in Boston. And then they came west to join their recently arrived parents in the Southern California town of Pasadena in 1893. If you look very closely, this is a photograph from 1894, downtown Pasadena. You can see the little sign projecting from the building here on the left. It says, Greene & Greene, Architect's Office. Charles had wanted to be an artist, but the parents told both boys they would be architects together, and that was that. Charles may have made a very good artist, too. His youthful painting here of the Mission San Gabriel, a beautiful watercolor that he did when he was 26, suggests a Ruskinian desire to capture a truth in the spirit of the place, not unlike the architectural detail that we saw from Ruskin a little earlier, right down to the weeds growing out of the wall. I'm sorry to say that little of special note came out of the Greenes' first 8 or 9 years of home design. This house from 1898, to my eye, is what I like to call an honest failure, combining as it does just about every stylistic element the Greenes might have picked up during their studies or apprenticeships. Things would soon change, however, in Charles Greene, the elder of the two brothers, and really the primary designer of the firm, fell in love. And his new bride was the English-born Alice Story White, shown here with Charles and her sisters on the left, and on a picnic with Charles on the right. They honeymooned for 4 months in England, beginning in April of 1901. 4 months in England, Scotland, Italy, and France. Sadly, I haven't got a slide of them on their honeymoon trip. It was maybe censored by their parents when they came back, but we'll just have to be okay with this picnic with Alice with her back to us. In London, the couple visited the Victoria and Albert Museum with its impressive green dining room decorated by Morris Marshall Faulkner and Company in the 1860s. In the Lake District, which was Alice Greene's childhood home, they may well have noticed the new houses just recently built, designed by prominent arts and crafts architects M.H. Bailey Scott, that is near Windermere, and CFA Voisey, Broadleys, and Moorcrag. And Blackwell, thank you, is the Bailey Scott house. Ruskin's passing at Brantwood just the year before may or may not have gone remarked by the Greenes, but they certainly knew of Ruskin. After a few days in the Lake District, Charles and Alice Greene progressed to Scotland, where they spent a day at the Glasgow International Exhibition. Charles Rennie Mackintosh had designed 4 commercial booths for the exposition, as well as one for the Glasgow School of Art, but no record exists of what the Greenes saw at the fair, what they paid special attention to, or what they might have thought of it all. What is certain, however, is that the work of Greene & Greene took a decided turn after Charles Greene's return to California. With fresh energy and inspiration, Charles and his brother Henry designed with new creativity and purpose. In October 1902, Charles wrote to their client, James, saying, I am in thorough sympathy with the William Morris movement. In fact, the whole inside of your house is influenced by it in design. While the Culbertson House is nominally what Americans at least perceive to be in the English style, it also bears some resemblance to the Port Sunlight cottages that they would have seen at the Glasgow exhibition. not to say any number of similar houses that evoked the past. The Greenes subscribed to the Craftsman magazine, which began publishing in October of 1901. The first issue was dedicated to William Morris, and the second issue dedicated to John Ruskin. Charles subscribed also to the International Studio, which was the American edition of the Studio, the Fine and Applied Art Journal published in London. Greene's annotated copies, by the way, are here in the Greene and Greene archives at the Huntington Library. In 1903, Charles Greene's sketches for a furnished cottage were published in the British journal Academy Architecture, and from that date, the firm began to design interior furnishings and to pay increasing attention to the entire ensemble of a commission: residence, siting and landscape, furnishings, light fixtures, carpets, metalwork, paint and stain finishes, etc., etc. The Greene brothers' ability to think and design both broadly, that is, architecturally, as well as in the more micro-focused and fine art sense, gives their work an ineffable quality of wholeness, what Central Europeans called Gesamtkunstwerk. Also from about 1901, the Greenes' architectural designs responded more fully to the local climate, the dramatic topography of the region, and the relaxed lifestyle of their clients. And this is, in fact, James Culbertson of the earlier house sitting on his terrace overlooking the Arroyo Seco in Pasadena. The natural environment of the Pacific Slope suggested the use of its own abundant materials: wood, river rock, locally produced brick, and these would typically be naturally expressed, unpainted. Eventually, the Greenes would source materials more broadly, globally even, for exotic hardwoods, as we'll see in a moment. They also looked farther afield to Japan and China for design inspirations, much as Japan and China had influenced Britain and Europe in the late 19th century. I think it's because the Greenes may have felt that these cultures, Japan and China and Korea, in fact, which also built in wood, could provide examples more relevant to life elsewhere on the Pacific Rim, long before that idea became current. Although Charles Greene avowed he was in thorough sympathy with the William Morris movement, Greene and Greene's designs evolved into a distinctive idiom that relied on a cohesion of design, materials, structure, and craftsmanship to create a pervasive decorative scheme that did not easily admit the more eclectic mix of objects often found in the English aesthetic interior, as we saw earlier. Nonetheless, the Greenes' work drew heavily on nature for its inspiration and is therefore linked to the English movement born of Ruskin's love of nature. Creating a house beautiful ideal for California became an obsessive pursuit for the Greene and Greene firm, with Charles as lead designer and his younger brother Henry indispensable as the practical conscience and steadying hand of the firm. By 1907, Greene and Greene were the artist-architects of choice for a short list of fortunate patrons, including David and Mary Gamble of the Procter & Gamble's, whose house is shown here. The Gambles appreciated the Greenes' approach to design with nature as a central focus. We need to realize, as Gabriel pointed out, how exciting it was for people to come from other parts of the country to California. There was an experimental field that even the Gambles must have shared in, and their correspondence reveals that excitement as they boarded the train in Cincinnati, in freezing Cincinnati in the winter, to come west to California for the season. The Greenes' favored contractor by the time the Gamble House was built, was Peter Hall, a Swede, and the preferred furniture maker was his brother, John. The Halls, with the Greenes, two pairs of brothers, would gain reputations as builders of exacting standards of excellence, just as the Greenes were becoming known as sensitive, creative, and holistic designers. The Gamble House in Pasadena is the most intact and original example of their work, the only house designed by the Greene and Greene firm that's open to the public, and which, thanks to the generosity of the Gamble family, retains nearly all of the original architect-designed furnishings. I hope those of you who are here from distant parts, and for those of you who are not from distant parts and mysteriously ignorant of the Gamble House, will take the opportunity to visit. But meanwhile, here are a few images to entice you. The theme is nature, whether it's in the stained glass tree design or in the pervasive use of unadorned wood. It is everywhere. There are also many routes of access to the outdoors, to the terraces, to sleeping porches that you saw earlier. It's all about getting outside and if you're inside, hoping that you'll be back outside soon. Nature is, the house, in fact, pulls you out almost the moment you walk in. Opposite the entry doors, the magnificent entry doors. At the other far end of the hall are the French doors leading out at grade to the rear terrace. I'll just let your eyes feast on the. This is called the image of the two suns. There's sunlight coming through the front doors and sunlight coming in through the western windows as well. So a very long exposure. And the dining room. While no match for Ruskin's craftsmanship as an artist, both Charles and Henry Greene painted and drew from nature with passion and talent, both professionally and recreationally. A drawing for furniture inlay such as this one typically called out changes in material to gain a desired effect of color or shading. Ebony for black, you can see here ebony. Maple for lighter shades. It even says maple, different colors. Knurled white oak where colored. There's a poche portion here for oak. And lignum vitae, ironwood, very hard wood, oak, vermilion from Indonesia, ebony from Africa. The Greenes also sketched for pleasure or self-improvement, such as this drawing by Charles Greene of a geranium leaf and foxglove, probably from his student days in Boston. Inlaid furniture was one of the primary outlets for Charles Greene's creativity, and he indulged it whenever he could persuade a client to follow along. In this more detailed work, he was as exacting as he was in the larger architectural expressions. The detailed and delicate inlay of a periwinkle, or vinca minor, likely as not uprooted from outside Charles Greene's home and placed on his drafting table there, in my view, completely rescues the Thorson House sideboard, shown on the right, upper right, from being ponderous and dull, however well-proportioned it may be. Note how faithfully the inlay design has been followed in its execution by the craft artisans who carried it out. Even Greene's periwinkle leaf, drawn with a worm-eaten edge there, is accurately executed here. This level of detail is carried out equally in the inlay for the dining tabletop and chair crest rails, bringing character and artistic interest to each piece of furniture in the room, a room with an abundance of material character in the book-matched panels of crotch mahogany, the leaded arc glass light fixtures, the rug designed by the architects, fireplace, metalwork, and other amenities. And by the way, some of this furniture, an example chair and the sideboard itself, are on permanent exhibit at the Greene & Greene exhibition in the Scott Galleries here at the Huntington. Another dash during lunch for you to make. The overall effect is of a thoughtfully developed and complete environment unlike any other. A work of architectural and interior art unique for these particular patrons and this particular place. The same care and craft attention was given to a living room library table. The full-scale drawing of the inlay calls out the various woods to be used, vermilion, oak knots, koa. The resulting inlay, then on the right, showing how each detail of the thorny rose branch is carried out by the craft workers as directed by the designer. Remarkably, the inlay is perfect today without any signs of shifting or delamination. The table inlay is of a piece with the room also, the room that it was designed for. And these are photographs taken at an exhibition that we did at the Thorson House in Berkeley in 1996. It resonates, that is, the inlay resonates not only with the trailing vine painted onto the frieze above the picture rail in the living room, but also with a similar vine pattern of copper and brass that is laid into the steel frame that surrounds the fireplace. You can just see on the slide on the right. Not everyone appreciated the Greenes' highly coordinated interiors. Mrs. J.W. Beswick Purchase wrote to her brother and sister-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Thorson, whose house we've just seen, as they were discussing interior appointments with Charles Greene. Mrs. Beswick Purchase had spent time in her other sister-in-law's house, also designed by Greene and Greene, but here in Pasadena, as the Blacker House, and she had this to say, quote, "Well, I find the outside of the house and grounds very pretty and attractive, but my impression, after moving through the various rooms, is that this architect has let his fancy run riot in wood. There is so much wood about the outside that when one finds oneself encased in wooden rooms, wooden wall, wood ceilings, wood floors, wood fixtures for light, well, one has a little bit of the feeling of a spider scrambling from one cigar box to another." Back in Pasadena, while the Gamble's furniture was being made for their bedroom in January of 1909, Charles Greene had a visit from the English architect and designer Charles Robert Ashby, whose promotional material for his American lectures styled him as, quote, "direct successor of William Morris in England," end quote. Ashby, according to his biographer Alan Crawford, was significantly influenced by Ruskin's writings, and he subscribed in particular to the value of art and handcraft in the social and moral economy. Ashby seems to have found a kindred spirit, too, in Charles Greene. This account appears in Ashby's journal at the Modern Archives, King's College, Cambridge. Quote, "I think C. Sumner Greene's work beautiful, among the best there is in this country. Like Lloyd Wright, the spell of Japan is on him. Like Lloyd Wright, he feels the beauty and makes magic out of the horizontal line. But there is in his work more tenderness, more subtlety, more self-effacement than in Wright's work, and it is more refined and has more repose. He, that is Charles Greene, fetched us in his auto again this afternoon," and the us would have been possibly Ashby and his wife, Janet. "Fetched us in his auto again this afternoon and drove us about, then took us to his workshops, where they were making, without exception, the best and most characteristic furniture I have seen in this country. In all, a supreme feeling for the material, quite up to our best English craftsmanship. Spooner, Barnsley, Lutchens, Leatherby. I have not felt so at home in any workshop on this side of the Atlantic. Here things were really alive, and the arts and crafts, what all the others are screaming and hustling about, are here actually being produced by a young architect, this quiet, dreamy, nervous, tenacious little man. After a visit to several of his houses in the Arroyo, Greene took us to tea with Mrs. Garfield, the widow of the murdered president. We looked out on the mountains and discussed single tacks in the intervals of tea and fingering the surface of Greene's scholarly paneling. As the afternoon wore on, a glorious sunset lit the snow on the mountains to rose red. I don't wonder the rich and great come to live in Pasadena, and it's certainly an education for them," end quote. The height of the Greenes' designs for furniture inlay, and therefore for the adornment of their idea of the house beautiful, must be the exquisite letterbox created for the Gamble's living room. The design for one of the panels depicts a tree next to a small waterfall designed in a Japanesque manner. Indeed, the tree recalls the Japanese black pine, which also appears to have inspired the Gamble's leaded glass entry doors seen in the earlier slide of the entry hall. A preliminary drawing for the letterbox, which is on the left, shows the designer's typical care in segmenting the various contrasting materials, although on this drawing, the materials are not yet identified. In the end, the needles of the tree were carried out in green jade, with the foam and flash of the waterfall brought to life in ivory and silver. A knot in the tree trunk protrudes in sufficient relief from the surface of the panel to serve as a tiny handle to pull open the cabinet panel. Right here. This was not just high art in the service of the House Beautiful, it was the epitome of useful beauty. With their makers and patrons as indispensable partners, Greene and Greene knew that they were creating a work of art worthy to be documented. Before it left the Hall Brothers workshop, Charles memorialized it in these snapshots, and then a contemporary image of the box, which can be seen on a tour of the Gamble House, by the way. The Gamble House stands as an example of the Greenes' response to the House Beautiful movement as they imagined it for the west coast of America. Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned a similar architecture for the prairies of the Midwest, and in 1897, he and his first house client, William Winslow, published in elegant book form the essay entitled The House Beautiful, written by the Unitarian minister William C. Gannett. This was followed the same year by the regular publication of the American magazine, House Beautiful, which styled itself, quote, the only magazine in America devoted to simplicity, economy, and appropriateness in the home, end quote. The magazine persists to this day. In the early 1950s, its editor, Elizabeth Gordon, was instrumental in reviving interest in the by then forgotten work of the Greenes as uniquely American links between the arts and crafts movement and modernism. And on the right, you'll see the issue from May 1950 that included a major article on Greene and Greene. The work of Greene and Greene was mostly of the rarefied artist-patron kind, work which nonetheless granted them and their professional staff and associated craft workers the opportunity to test their skills to a remarkable depth and breadth. It also allowed them the opportunity to take pride and pleasure in bringing useful and beautiful things into being, the very hope that Ruskin harbored for all craft workers. And we have reason to believe from the documents in the Greene and Greene archives and letters, and even just this past week, a letter from one of the descendants of one of the subcontractors, offering information on his I believe, great-grandfather's work for Greene and Greene and how proud he is of that. The Greenes were blessed with a wealthy clientele, but their clients were also discerning and appreciative. And we should not forget that their work was for the wealthy, but it had a broad influence on the more humble bungalow found in neighborhoods nearly everywhere. Today, the tens of thousands who visit the Gamble House each year can feel at least a measure of the appreciation and pride the Greenes' patrons felt. The Greenes fell out of fashion. Oh, it should be noted also that the Procter & Gamble Company, by the way, was the very first company in America to institute a profit-sharing program for all of its workers in the mid-19th century. The Greenes fell out of fashion when the Great War came and the income tax, not incidentally, also came about in 1913, and it made commissions on the scale of the Gamble House impractical and unaffordable. In 1915, Charles Greene photographed and then painted the sad, if picturesque, ruin of Mission San Antonio de Padua while on a family camping trip in Monterey County. The following year, he moved with his family to the nearby artist colony of Carmel by the Sea. He had complained to a friend that he had felt he had been, quote, prostituting his art in Pasadena, end quote. By 1923, he and his sons had built this studio using discarded brick from a demolished hotel. The freestanding arcade, shown in the lower right, serves as a picturesque fence reminiscent of the ruined mission Charles had painted. The studio was Charles Greene's retreat, his own house beautiful, where he studied theosophy and Buddhism and where he went to paint and write or design the occasional piece of furniture for a former client. Charles Greene, the quiet and highly spiritual seeker of truth, a nonconformist of the first water, throughout his life would never abandon his devotion to and quest for beauty in art and craft. In 1917, Greene quoted Ruskin in an article titled "Architecture as a Fine Art," which Greene had written for the article for the Architect, the journal titled "The Architect," and he quotes Ruskin saying, "A great architect must be a great sculptor or painter. If he is not, he is only a builder." It was as much Greene's lament as it was Ruskin's, and a bond between two men who had never met, yet shared much. For his part, Henry Greene continued to design on his own in Pasadena until 1935, when he closed his office. Neither brother regained his pre-war momentum in architecture, but they found fulfillment in other ways. The two brothers were very different, but loved each other and had a lifelong bond. In 1952, thanks in large part to their recent rediscovery in the magazine House Beautiful, they received together a special citation from the American Institute of Architects, lauding them as, quote, "sensitive and knowing builders who reflected with grace and craftsmanship emerging values in modern living, formulators of a new and native architecture." Thank you very much.